The morning of June 22nd, 1941, turned out to be cold and silent along the entire length of the vast Soviet border. 3 million German soldiers crouched in the pre-dawn darkness, waiting for the signal that was supposed to launch the largest military operation in the history of human wars. Behind them, in the command structures and planning offices that stretched across occupied Europe all the way to Berlin, a group of people who understood the war with a depth and precision that was available only to a few sat with their personal doubts and professional obligations, waiting with the people they commanded. Field Marshal Walter von Brauchitsch, the nominal commander-in-chief of the German army, had previously expressed serious concerns about the timetable for this campaign. General Franz Halder, chief of staff for the army, filled his personal diary with careful calculations of Soviet human reserves, which told a story significantly darker than the official optimism surrounding the operation. Colonel General Heinz Guderian, whose armored forces cut through France at a speed that in retrospect still seemed like a dream, studied maps of the Russian interior, performed arithmetic calculations on fuel consumption and road quality, and came to conclusions that he carefully kept to himself. And above all of them, in a way that by this point in the war had become something close to absolute, stood Adolf Hitler. He arrived this morning carrying the accumulated burden of 5 years of being right when everyone else was wrong. Every general who told him that an adventure was too dangerous looked timid and petty when that adventure succeeded. Every diplomat who warned him that a particular act of aggression would trigger a catastrophic response watched as their predictions did not come true. The world blinked repeatedly and completely, but Hitler did not. This experience did something irreversible to the architecture of his mind. This convinced him, with a confidence so deep that it became structural rather than just intellectual, that his instincts represented a form of knowledge superior to any other form available to him. In his own mind, he was not a man who was sometimes right. He was a man who operated on a different plane of perception than ordinary people. This quality, this absolute and unshakable confidence, was the engine of everything he achieved. When he ordered the remilitarization of the Rhineland in 1936, General Ludwig Beck, then serving as chief of the general staff, was among those who warned with considerable force that France would not tolerate provocation and would respond militarily, trapping Germany in a confrontation that she could not yet win. France did not respond. When Hitler announced the annexation of Austria in 1938, the professional military establishment once again prepared for the consequences that never came. When a campaign against Czechoslovakia was being planned, Beck was so alarmed that he resigned rather than participate in what he believed would be a catastrophic miscalculation. Beck's resignation was accepted. Hitler continued. Czechoslovakia fell without provoking the European war that Beck was so afraid of. And so by the time the Wehrmacht crossed into the Soviet Union that June morning, Hitler had accumulated an unbroken list of triumphs over the careful professional judgment of the people around him. And this track record turned his confidence from a psychological trait into something closer to the ruling theology. The first weeks of Operation Barbarossa seemed to confirm everything that this theology demanded. Guderian's panzer group was rushing east with a ferocity and a speed that consumed miles. Field Marshal Wilhelm Ritter von Lieb was pushing Army Group north towards Leningrad. His forces cut through the Soviet defenses, which were crumbling with what appeared to be complete determination. Field Marshal Fyodor von Bock commanded Army Group Center, the most powerful of the three branches. And the encirclement that his troops achieved at Minsk and then at Smolensk was of a scale that had no precedent in the history of military operations. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers were captured in operations that seemed to confirm the German assessment that the Red Army, devastated by Stalin's purges of its officer corps, was an institution in a state of terminal collapse. General Halder, observing the accumulating figures in his diary, wrote at the end of July that the Soviet campaign could be considered essentially resolved. It was a conclusion he would bitterly regret putting on paper, because something was happening beneath the impressive surface of the German offensive that none of the victory reports fully reflected. The Soviet Union behaved differently from France. He didn't behave like Poland. He absorbed destruction on a scale that would have wiped out any Western European nation multiple times and continued to build resistance out of the ruins. When one Soviet army was destroyed, another appeared. When one defensive line was breached, another materialized further east. Geography itself was a kind of opponent. The distances were truly staggering. Roads were often non-existent. The supply lines stretching back to Germany were operating at the absolute limit of what the Wehrmacht's logistics system was designed for. It was in this context that the first great strategic dispute of the Eastern Front broke out. And it was in this debate that the nature of Hitler's greatest power first began to reveal its hidden face. Von Bock, whose army group center was positioned most advantageously for the offensive on Moscow, insisted on concentrating Germany's main armored efforts against the Soviet capital. Guderian, whose tank forces were the spearhead of this potential spear, defended the same case with the passionate concreteness of a man who had thought about armored warfare all his professional life. Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge, who commanded the Fourth Army under von Bock, added his support to the argument about Moscow. Their reasoning was not just territorial. Moscow was the hub through which approximately 70% of Soviet military logistics passed. Its capture would have severed ties between different parts of the Soviet army in such a way that it would have created cascading collapses along the entire front. The psychological impact of losing the capital would be enormous. Every military consideration pointed in the same direction. Hitler pointed in the other direction. He ordered the armored forces of Army Group Center to turn south, towards Ukraine, towards the industrial resources of Donbass and the agricultural riches of the Chernozem region. When Guderian flew to his headquarters to personally defend the cause of Moscow, a remarkable act for a subordinate general and a measure of how strongly Guderian felt a strategic mistake was being made. Hitler listened to him with apparent patience and then completely rejected his arguments. Guderian's arguments were tactically and operationally complex. Hitler's answer was based on a completely different kind of logic. The logic of a man who had learned to trust his instincts more than any externally generated analysis, no matter how well-founded it might be. He needed the resources of Ukraine. He needed Crimea. He believed that these goals were more fundamentally important than the traditional military goal of destroying the main enemy forces. The subsequent encirclement of Kiev was, in the narrow terms of combat arithmetic, one of the most impressive German victories of the entire war. General Maximilian von Wakes and the forces operating around him participated in the encirclement of approximately 650,000 Soviet soldiers. The numbers are so big that they seemed almost fictional. Hitler pointed to Kiev as a confirmation. His instincts were right again. But what the victory at Kiev actually achieved was the consumption of irreplaceable weaks. The depletion of armored formations that had been operating continuously since June, and the surrender of the only remaining window in which the rush to Moscow could be completed before the Russian winter came in full force. When the offensive on Moscow actually resumed in October under the operational name Typhoon, Field Marshal von Bock threw his forces forward with everything they had. The initial results were impressive again. Two more huge encirclements near Vyazma and Bryansk took several 100,000 more Soviet prisoners. And for a moment, it seemed that Moscow was really within reach. But then the rains came, and the Russian roads, which never had much to say, disappear when the offensive on Moscow actually resumed in October the operational name Typhoon. Field Marshal von Bock threw his forces forward with everything they had. The initial results were impressive again. Two more huge encirclements near Vyazma and Bryansk took several 100,000 more Soviet prisoners. And for a moment, it seemed that Moscow was really within reach. But then THNS came, and the Russian roads, which never had much to say, disappeared. Guderian's tank formations were literally immobilized. Their vehicles sank on their axles. Guderian's tank formations were literally immobilized. The vehicles sank on their axles in the mud, which no engineering efforts could overcome. The German term for this, Schlammperiode, the season of mud, has become one of the scariest words in the operational vocabulary of the Wehrmacht. And then, before the mud had even really frozen, the cold came. The temperature dropped with a speed and severity that German meteorological records had not prepared anyone for. The soldiers found that their weapons W measured in days.